Hello, and welcome to the All Things Narrative podcast, where we explore the relationships between the stories we love and the stories we live. I'm your host, Derrick Hatch, and let's get started. This is it, y'all, the final episode of 2023. Woo! And episode 62 of the All Things Narrative podcast. Wow, there's been so much ground that we've covered in the last 2 years when it comes to storytelling, how stories influence us, asking what our own story is and how we're going to live that story out and make the most of it. Well, my friends, this is not only the final episode of the year for this podcast, it is the final episode of the podcast as we know it. Because after doing much soul searching and getting wisdom from people a lot smarter than me, one of the things that I've recognized is what the podcast needs to be. So over the last couple years, you've heard a variety of different episodes. You've heard interviews with guests, learning their stories. You've heard episodes kind of like this, where it's just me at the mic, talking about narrative therapy principles or different things about personal development in our lives. And you've heard episodes where we talk about specific stories. This is with the guys, the ones with Joseph and Nick and Jason. And so I've been listening to y'all. I know you listen to me, but I've been listening to y'all. I've been looking at the stats. I've been seeing what y'all are interested in. I've been hearing feedback. And so many of you have helped shape this podcast in ways you don't even realize. But one of the things that I've decided in light of this, and this also came from taking the guys, we took a retreat a few months ago up to a beach house in Daytona. And we just kind of dreamed and thought about, well, what can this podcast be in the future? And so we've decided that we are going to relaunch and rebrand the podcast starting in January 2024, because we have gained some clarity over what this show needs to be and what you, from what we've gathered, want it to be. Before I launch into this final solo episode, where I'm going to kind of recap the genres and talk a little bit about what it means for our lives and kind of give a condensed version of what our Why We Loves have been this year, I want to tell you that come next year, when you click on this podcast, it's going to look and sound and feel a little different, but familiar. It'll sound a bit different because we are going to be recording in a professional studio rather than my house. I mean, I love recording in my office. It's a great little setup I've got here, but we do want to take it to the next level. And with that, we are also bringing Nick, Joseph, and Jason on full time. Woo! Which means that you'll get to hear them on pretty much every episode moving forward. And the episodes are going to shorter, but I believe more impactful. A lot of fluff is going to be cut, and we're going to really get to the meat of it. Because I don't just have these guys now for one moment a month to get all their thoughts on different stories. Now we're going to actually get to spread ourselves out and take our time as we dive into different stories and what they mean for our lives. And so with all that, we decided that it was time to change the name. Now, I'm not changing the name of my business. My business is still All Things Narrative, and this podcast is still presented by All Things Narrative, and this podcast still works in tandem with All Things Narrative. But we have decided that that is not what this podcast is. We are going to focus on something very specific moving forward, and that is, how do stories and films help us navigate through life? How are they going to help us navigate our life with all the complexities and challenges that we face? And how do stories, in particular films, how do they shape us and influence and inspire us towards the kind of stories that we want to live? And so that is why we are renaming our podcast to, drum roll please, live a meaningful story, which probably doesn't sound surprising for a lot of you. That is the name of my coaching program, but that ultimately is the aim of what this podcast is here for. We are here to inspire you, the listener, and ourselves through this conversation to live a meaningful story. And so this is going to be the podcast where we fuse film analysis and narrative therapy ideas and principles and practices together. I know. And being able to have these things exist in dialogue in terms of the kind of stories that we want to live. So ultimately, focus on our personal development and growth. And so not only are we going to dive deep into talking about films like we have been, but we're going to take more of a personal note and talk about, well, what do these stories mean to us in our lives? And what sort of things can we challenge one another with? What sort of things can you take away from these stories as well with where you're at in life? And so it's going to be a beautiful time. You're going to notice a lot more of a rhythm in the format of the episodes. You'll also notice more episodes as we're going to be doing these once a week rather than once every other week. And so it's really, really exciting. And I hope you'll stick along for the ride. If you love that this podcast focuses on narrative therapy, practices, principles, that whole world, that's not going anywhere. That's going to still be here. If you're here for the film episodes, we love it. And if you like the interview episodes, we'll have guests on every once in a while. But this is definitely not going to be an interview show moving forward. This is going to be conversations, meaningful conversations amongst friends and people who are on this journey together, because the four of us really do have a special bond that carries outside this podcast. And we really all are challenging each other to live a meaningful story. And we want to give you a taste of that through our conversations in fullness. But before we do that, we have one final episode here to do. And that is kind of a recap of all these different genres. We've spent the last year learning about different genres. We've been through Eric Williams's book on the screenwriter's taxonomy and trying to find what sorts of stories we need in our lives, and recognizing, if I don't like this kind of story, why? What is it about the stories that I'm drawn to and the stories that I'm repelled away from? And so in each of those genre episodes, I gave a brief, 1 minute description that I came up with, inspired by many great things, of course. But these descriptions kind of help make that connection of these genres to our lives. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read these descriptions. You're going to hear them. Some of them might be a little tweaked or different than when you originally heard them. And there'll be some recommended films that you can start to get into if either that genre resonates with you or you want more of it in your life, or if you're just curious. And here's what I want to challenge you to do. As you listen to each of these genres, ask yourself what aspects of them connect, resonate, reverberate with your life and how you see the world and your story, and which ones don't and why. Because I think there's a place for all of these genres in our lives, but we have to take the time to figure out where they fit in. But there's definitely going to be at least one or two of these, I know it's true for me, that we really gravitate towards and that really say something about ourselves. And this is something I have all my clients do in my Live a Meaningful Story coaching program, is we go through these genres and they think about them and they think about stories in their lives within these genres that are meaningful to them. Yeah, let's go ahead and take a journey. First up is the romance genre. The romance story represents our passions awakened and ignited longing to be fulfilled. A romance is that which we give all of ourselves to, that which we long to possess, but in reality possesses us. It's what you ultimately desire and pursue to your utmost fullest, that which you are willing to lay down your own life for. These stories explore our relationships with the physical, namely other people, who represent the best of what we want and what we need. But these romances test us, challenging us to rise above our ego and embrace the other in spite of their imperfections. Ultimately, the romance story reminds us that love, in one form or another, triumphs over all. Some romance films I'd recommend would include 500 Days of Summer, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Romeo and Juliet, When Harry Met Sally, and Your Name. All right, next up is the action genre and Adventurous Journeys. The action story is one filled with visceral, cathartic moments that test characters physically and mentally. We are invited to travel with our protagonists along a journey with each escalating trial as they strive to defeat evil and bring about good. These stories allow us to identify with the protagonists, challenging us to ponder how we might handle their situation if we were in it. The action genre reminds us that internal transformation serves a larger purpose in helping us courageously face the external challenges of life. The action thereby shapes one's identity, each action set piece serving as a turning point in the narrative. Meaningful action stories powerfully illustrate to us how there are battles worth fighting, beauties worth rescuing, and ultimately, adventures worth living. Some action films I'd recommend include Die Hard, the Indiana Jones films, the James Bond films, Pirates of the Caribbean, Seven Samurai, and Top Gun Maverick. All right, next up is the fantasy genre. The fantasy story invites us to get lost in a visually enticing world of wonder. On the surface, these worlds of talking beasts and magical incantations are not like our own. Yet they serve as a mirrored reflection of our own reality, with exaggerated characters representing different facets of our existence. These archetypes echo our complex psychologies, embodying our subconscious fears and desires. Many great fantasies are tales of a human in the world of enchanted myth and supernatural wonder. Along the way, they explore new lands, meet new companions, and discover profound truths about themselves and the world around them. As the protagonist navigates their quest, we are challenged to think about how we navigate our own world. Because fantasy explores not only what is possible within the realm of imagination, but what is desirable for our own lives. Fantasy causes us to reflect on what we want and what we don't want for our world. As we move from the familiar to the unfamiliar, we daydream in fantasy land in order to return to the real world with something of value, something that will sustain us throughout the various quests we find ourselves in. These stories help us encounter the magical within nature, the mystical within the spiritual, and the myth that reveals our fractured humanity. Fantasy ultimately reminds us that we are created beings, given the ability to create and birth new worlds of endless possibilities. Some fantasy stories I'd recommend include the Chronicles of Narnia series, the Harry Potter series, Lord of the Rings series, the original Star Wars trilogy, The Wizard of Oz, and the works of Studio Ghibli. next up is science fiction, aka the sci-fi genre. The science fiction story is about taking what seems impossible and making it probable. Whereas fantasy stories take us to imaginary worlds, science fiction narratives bring the imaginative to our world. These stories challenge our ethics of what we are willing to do for the sake of the greater good, while provoking society's notions of what desired progress might look like. In a protagonist's quest to comprehend the unknowable, they come to better understand themselves and their place in the world. Because even though science fiction explores realms of the technological and the alien, these are ultimately human stories about the human condition and whether humanity can be or is even worth saving. Is mankind in control of its own destiny, or are we simply along for the ride? And what does it mean to live authentically as a human being in an ever-changing world? Some science fiction stories I'd recommend include Back to the Future, Blade Runner 2049, Dune, the Hunger Games series, Planet of the Apes films, and WALL-E. All right, next up is the crime genre and the mysterious thrillers we find in our stories. The crime genre explores the tension between the lawbreakers and the law keepers. Depending upon whose perspective we are given, we may be rooting for a detective, lawyer, sheriff, criminal, or antihero. Crime is often paired with a mystery, stringing us along a ride that invites us to solve the case in a timely fashion. In these crime stories, we must decide who is right and who is wrong, and whose side we are ultimately on. Can we find freedom and maintain justice in a world flooded with corruption and chaos? Some crime stories I'd recommend include 12 Angry Men, The Godfather, Memento, No Country for Old Men, The Shawshank Redemption, and Vertigo. Next up is the Western genre. The Western story is a gritty depiction of order taming chaos. These tales are about rugged individuals who must act on their own codes of honor and justice in a wayward society. The lines from morality are usually drawn by a good character, sheriff, gunslinger, bounty hunter, who seeks to bring order at all costs, even through vengeance. There's a morally gray character who straddles the lines between good and bad, and a bad character, the outlaw, cowboy, foreigner, who corrupts society and is not above killing women and children. The protagonist becomes slowly peeled away from his sense of security as his duty to society overtakes his personal life. These stories tend to culminate in a climactic duel between the forces of order and chaos. The Western is the only genre whose origins are tied to a particular moment in history, the 19th century expansion of America into the new frontier. Although Westerns aren't just confined to this era alone. As a result, many Westerns incorporate elements of history into their narratives, whether it be settlers navigating the emergence of new towns, tensions with Native Americans, or utilizing the backdrop of the Civil War Reconstruction periods. Westerns challenge us to ask ourselves, how far am I willing to go to tame the chaos around me? Some Western stories I'd recommend include The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Once Upon a Time in the West, Shane, Stagecoach, Tombstone, and The Unforgiven. is the horror genre. The horror story taps into our deepest psychological fears, drawing them to the surface so that we might confront them. As we descend into hell, we may only escape by sheer coincidence or dumb luck. Our aversion to witnessing horror reminds us that there is a healthy side to fear, that there are in fact real dangers that affect us physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. In another sense, though, horror can embolden us to not run away from fears, but to face them head on. Protagonists face these fears by learning how to overcome a monster that stands in the way of harmony. These monsters can be physical creatures or human, ones that are symbolic of a psychological state, such as vampires, werewolves, and mummies. These monsters can be abstract forces of nature gone awry, and if one is not careful, the protagonists can find themselves in a tragedy where they are at risk of becoming the monster in their own story. Ultimately, horror serves as a chilling reminder of what we are capable of doing to ourselves and the world around us. Some horror stories I'd recommend, if you can handle it, are The Exorcist, The Fly, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Shining, Sweeney Todd, and The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. All right, next up is the slice of life genre. Slice of life stories ground us in a sense of reality, towing the lines between comedy and drama. Whereas other genres take us to places outside the known and familiar, slice of life stories help us engage deeper with the mundane settings and situations we find ourselves in. We root for the protagonist to make day-to-day decisions, no matter how big or small, because it is in those decisions that we get a sense of who they are. Slice of life can either depict the daily life of an individual or encompass an ensemble cast with interlinked narratives that converge around common themes. Since characters mirror the complexities of human life, antagonists in slice of life stories tend to be abstract forces such as time or death. But the antagonist may very well just be someone with different goals than the protagonist. These stories come down to a choice that must be made, one that will set the protagonist on a path that extends beyond the time we spend with them. Though the struggles of humanity are universal, slice of life stories remind us that the way we deal with those struggles is indicative of the person we can become. Some slice of life stories I'd recommend include Almost Famous, Citizen Kane, The Color Purple, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, A Silent Voice, and The Royal Tenenbaums. So what you've just heard are 8 core genres: romance, action, combining it with adventure, fantasy, science fiction, crime, bringing thriller into it as well, western, horror, and slice of life. Now, there are 4 other genres that we talked about. So one that we didn't do an episode on, but integrated a bit in our slice of life episode, is the sports genre or the underdog genre, the us versus them story. And so typically these stories fall under slice of life, but they do have a certain rhythm and cadence to them. The 3 that we did do episodes on, though, that I want to read the descriptions of include the historical narrative, which can encompass different things such as the biopic, war, historical fiction, political epics, different things like that. We know that these are genres in and of themselves, but we kind of lump them together under this category of historical narratives. And then there's also the superhero story, which is actually kind of can blend in with the other genres. It's primarily derived from a combination of the action and either fantasy or science fiction genres. But there are enough of these stories to where we feel like they can act as a genre in and of themselves. And then finally, the last one we'll do, which is one that's pretty much unique to this podcast in terms of language. You won't really find this anywhere else, but this is the Metaphysical Journey. And the more I've thought about it, it's not really a genre per se. It's more of a pathway of how you take a character through a story. But I do think that we had a really interesting conversation about these kinds of stories. And so I am going to share those last three genres here. So here we go. Starting with the historical narratives. History is our attempt to make sense of the past by organizing it into meaningful patterns. Historical narratives give us context for where we've been, so we can better understand where we are and where we want to go. Whether based on true events or primarily fictional, the historical settings are fundamental to their storytelling. From war films to biopics to political epics, these stories put us in touch with the past so that we can never forget, lest we are doomed to repeat it. Some historical narratives I love, biopics, which are based on true stories. There's a lot of them. Some works of historical fiction, Casablanca, Inglourious Bastards, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and then war films like 1917. Next up, we're going to do the superhero genre. The superhero story embraces the pattern of the hero's journey. Superheroes first undergo an origin story that made them who they are. They are then challenged to find their place in the world, often balancing between the mundane and the extraordinary. Their stories usually culminate in making a choice that sets them apart from a villain, one that is often sacrificial and indicative of the tough choices we must make in life. Their ultimate goal is to undergo a transformation that will help them defeat the villain that opposes what they stand for. Superheroes take responsibility for the brokenness of the world and act nobly, helping as many people as they can along the way. These stories inspire us to take whatever we've been given and use it to act heroically, even if it costs us something. Some films I'd recommend include the Avengers films, Logan, the Spider-Man Spider-Verse films, Superman, and The Dark Knight. Last but not least is the Metaphysical Journey. The Metaphysical Journey is a story that focuses primarily on a protagonist experiencing some sort of philosophical, religious, or spiritual awakening. While most stories focus on our relationships with the physical, the Metaphysical Journey focuses on our relationships with what's beyond the physical, with the abstracts of life, namely reality itself. While most other stories focus primarily on external conflict, the metaphysical turns inward, where confronting external obstacles becomes the means towards achieving inward enlightenment. The main goal is for the characters to achieve some sort of epiphany that alters the course of their life. These stories speak to our connection with the divine, the ground of being, ultimate reality, God, and life itself. They call us deeper into the deepest parts of ourselves as we mine the depths of the universe, searching for what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, and ultimately, what is real. Some metaphysical journeys I recommend include the stories of the Bible, Frankenstein, Groundhog Day, Pinocchio, and The Truman Show. So there you have it. Which of those 11 descriptions did you find a connection to in your life? I'd love to hear if you want to take the time to send us a message, comment, or an email. You can email me at Derrick, Derrick, at allthingsnarrative.com. You can also check out allthingsnarrative.com for our coaching, workshops, classes. If you want to dive deep into this stuff, if you want to experience personal development through storytelling, then this is your place to be. And it'd be an honor to connect with you. If you'd like to check out more film recommendation for each of these genres, follow me on Letterboxd at The Narrative Guy, or just simply click on the link in the show notes. You can also follow us on social media at All Things Narrative, so you never miss an update. And so in closing, I just want to say again, thank you so much to everybody who has been a part of this journey of the All Things Narrative podcast as it is. This podcast is resurrecting, and it is transforming into what we believe the best version of itself is going to be. And so we ask you to stick with us as we move towards living a meaningful story, one day at a time. And I hope you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy Holidays, that you stay safe out there, and we will be back with you in 2024. Woo! All right, everybody. Thank you so much. This is Derrick Hatch, your friendly narrative practitioner, signing off, saying thank you. And until next time, live a meaningful story.